Hi, everyone. Welcome to another session of American Public Policy Redux. Today is April 22nd. Tonight, we are going to talk about government accountability and oversight with two of our fabulous American Public Policy Redux regulars and St. Mary's alumni. And we're so very excited to have them here to share the breadth of their experience and knowledge with us. As always, we are being recorded, so if you wish to be recorded, jump on in, or if you have a question, you will be recorded, I guess I should say. And then if you do not wish to be recorded, but you do have a question, just send it in the chat box and I'll answer it. But pipe in anytime. And with that, ladies, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So welcome everyone to our discussion on government accountability and oversight agencies, which are sometimes lovingly referred to as your government watchdogs or your taxpayer's best friend. So I thought I'd start by introducing myself. I feel like I know most everybody on this call, but to tell you a little bit about my connection with the topic by way of a quick bio. Of course, I graduated from St. Mary's and I had an economics and political science major and went on to get my master's in public administration from the University of Georgia. I have been with the Georgia Department of Audits and Accounts for 27 years, all of them in the performance audit division, the last 13 of which I've been the director, and I have the great privilege of leading a small but mighty group of people, 31 of us that are analysts who are really excited about improving government, and I just have to say they're wicked smart. So they're a great group of people to be around in our pursuit of better government. I am going to present information about the Georgia Department of Audits and a little bit about other state departments that are similar to mine, as well as a little bit on GAO, which is kind of the federal counterpart of the agency that I work for. I do want to caveat it though that I have never worked for GAO, so what I'm about to present is based on relationships I've had with people or presenters we've had from GAO or any research I did for tonight. Also, the information that I'm going to present on performance auditing and my work are really just my views and not necessarily the views of my employer. And I'm going to hand it over to you for your bio.
Okay, great. So thank you. I think the other thing that I wanted to add about your intro is the other affectionate name that some of the folks, at least in the Inspector General's office, were called junkyard dogs. So you can look that up if you want to see the history of that. But we used to have a newsletter called the Junkyard Dog Journal. So anyway, people have had a lot of fun with that. So it is truly a pleasure to be here. And again, I'll similarly just give folks my background, specifically with respect to this work. So, I graduated from St. Mary's in 1988 and actually went to work for the Inspector General in Chicago in November of that year. And the reason I made that connection was when I was on Washington semester, I had an internship with the Office of Inspector General in DC, right down from Capitol Hill, and spent time working on the Hill and doing work in that office. And that connection ultimately led to what was my second job out of college. So I was pretty young and eager, and I joined the office of about 15 folks. And Pat, you'll remember Bill Moran is the one who hired me, who been my mentor for many, many years and a wonderful person. So anyway, so that's where I started. And I started really doing field work, doing inspections and studies for about 4 years. I did a year stint with the Department of Transportation, where I went with 3 colleagues to actually help establish a new evaluation office within the Department of Transportation Inspector General. So that was very interesting to get to work at a different Inspector General. And then I came to DC to the headquarters office and again worked for the Inspector General. And I'm sorry, this was the HHS Inspector General. So this is the Health and Human Services Inspector General, and spent basically was there until 1996. during that time, I went to night school and got my MPA at George Mason University, which was a lot of fun. And then I spent my 2 years at the Department of Justice, Office of Inspections, and did some really fun work at Department of Justice. So I've got a range of experiences across inspectors general, mostly at HHS, but also at some of these other agencies. And then I ended up coming to Atlanta for 3 years and I was the regional inspector general and headed up an office of about 15 folks and directed those national evaluation studies. So I've seen the work from a lot of different angles, both starting out as an analyst, moving all the way up to a regional inspector general. So I'm going to share that. It has been, I have not been at the inspector general's office since 2006. So, I do follow a little bit sort of what's happening, but most of my experience is really between 1988 and 2006. And similarly, what I'm presenting here are my views and my, my own views and knowledge about the inner workings of the organizations and not the views of my former employer at HHS. So with that, we're going to get things a little bit warmed up here with a video. And I have to say, from the time that I was in the Inspector General's office, where we just had our blue reports, that's all we had. Now, not only Inspectors General, but GAO, and I think at Georgia too, they have podcasts and Twitter accounts and Facebook. So, the way that they're communicating their information has definitely evolved over the years. And I was really, really happy to see that. So I'm going to share my screen and if I can pull this up. Of course, it worked when I tested it. There we go.
It's called the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, and it's the investigative arm of Congress.
Just mentioned some of the discoveries in this GAO report show that there are 18
It's often cited as the independent source in Washington, in a town of spin and partisanship.
The GAO will document GAO investigations have been commissioned.
And in this latest GAO
GAO
report,
exists to support the Congress in carrying out its constitutional responsibilities, both in creating legislation and crafting it, in making difficult resource trade-off decisions, and in providing effective oversight to make sure our system of checks and balances works.
the GAO produces reports on topics ranging from the war in Iraq to environmental issues.
It calls the shots as it sees them and gives us the facts. That's what Democrats and Republicans in Congress want, and I think that's a great service for the American people.
A Government Accountability Office investigation is raising serious questions about the program. The GAO uncovered at least 16 individuals later accused of involvement.
Bi-monthly report mandated by the Recovery Act came out with a third one just a bit ago. The highlights, 48 of the 49 billion.
More than 3,000 people who give us the nonpartisan reports and fact-finding that we absolutely rely on.
GAO is a guardian operating on behalf of the American taxpayer, and so it's very important for us to do the work, but also communicate it effectively to decision makers so that positive change can result.
The GAO says they return about $114 on every dollar that's spent on them, and if you tally it up over the years, that comes out to about $58 billion.
Based on the financial condition and looking forward to in terms of trends and broad trends in mail volume and things of that nature, we feel
GAO analysts testify on Capitol Hill about 300 times a year. The topics they investigate are either requested by a member of Congress or are required by law, like oversight of the bank TARP fund.
As the government tightens its belt, the GAO, which has been labeled the American taxpayer's best friend, must remain an unabashed advocate for the public and a protective steward of federal resources.
I pledge to faithfully and diligently carry out the mission of the GAO to support the Congress in carrying out its constitutional responsibilities and to help improve the performance and accountability of the federal government for the benefit of the American people. Performance and accountability of the federal government for the benefit.
Great. So let me stop sharing. So, you know, what I really liked about that video, it's a great overview of a lot of what Leslie and I are going to talk about today. And even though the video was about GAO, a lot of the way that the work is described, the way that they talk about their mission, you could have put in the Inspector General, and probably similarly at the state level for Georgia. So there's this, and this is one of the first things that we're going to talk about, are some of the commonalities between these oversight agencies, who really, having lived in this world for a long time, and even going back and looking at some of the literature and the news stories, it's just striking how there's this really strong sense of purpose and mission across a lot of these agencies. So I'm gonna dive in, and Leslie and I are gonna tag team it, so hopefully make this a little bit interesting. Please stop and ask questions. If you have questions throughout, we're happy to do that. You know, we're fairly close to the subject matter, so if we gloss over something or don't explain something fully, just happy to answer it. You can put it in the chat box and Michelle will ask us. Or again, if there's a term we use that you're not familiar with, happy to answer that. But essentially what we're going to do today is Leslie and I are going to go over some commonalities about these oversight organizations, talk a little bit about their structure, because one of the most important things about these oversight agencies that makes them effective is their independence. And there are some really important structural things that were built into their statutes to help provide that independence, which is really crucial to their ability to achieve their mission to you know, provide timely and, you know, responsive information to decision makers to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of programs. I haven't worked there in 14 years. I can still say the mission, right? Because it's just so ingrained in who I am. So we're going to talk about some commonalities. We're going to go a little bit back into history and give you a history of the Inspector General, just to give you a little bit of a framework. Talk a little bit about operations. Well, how do they do their work? Okay, how do they do it, and how do they effectively do it? And then what we're going to do is link up some of the work that they do with some policy implications, which actually are going to link back to some themes that we've talked about in other sessions, and talk a little bit about some of the impact that these agencies have had over the years. And then obviously we're also going to address a little bit about some of the challenges. So that's kind of the overview, so you know what to expect. So I'm going to dive right in, okay, with some of the common traits across these organizations. And I think I've already touched on the first one, which is really this really strong sense of mission. These agencies, they don't administer programs, okay? Their sole laser focus, right, is to whether they're conducting an audit or an evaluation or doing a criminal investigation, is really all about improving government. So that's what they bring, and they all, you know, they all bring that to their work. And when you talk to these folks, you know, they're just all about how can we make things better. So they're really, I don't know, maybe they're like the JFK, you know, we're here in government to serve kind of folks. I don't know, but it's a really strong sense of mission. There's a lot of professionalism. You know, these are professional auditors, you know, criminal investigators, a lot of MPA types, government types. You know, these are highly credentialed folks. They really, in addition to the imperative for them to be nonpartisan, and in the case of the Inspector General, it's actually written into their statute that they come to these jobs as nonpartisan, but they're very clear about being objective. And I'll never forget, as a young analyst, okay, shortly after I joined the organization and I went to a national conference, we had a very he was quite an effective early leader at HHS, Inspector General Dick Kucero, who actually was a former FBI agent. And he was very tall and he had a very powerful presence. And he actually created our evaluation function. And I'll never forget going to this conference. And, you know, we're out in the middle of, I think we're at Cool Font, West Virginia, you know, and I don't know, we're all just sort of very casual. We come in there and he gives us this rousing speech about when you walk underneath the portals of the Inspector General's office, you are objective, you are professional, I mean, he was just, this is who we are, this is our sense of mission. So you really get that sense with these agencies about how they feel about their work. I think the other acknowledgement, and we're going to talk about this in different ways throughout the presentation, that's really important to these agencies is their ability to work with others. And we're going to talk a little bit about where they're situated organizationally, but their ability to work with Congress and work within the agencies that they work for is extremely important. And I'm going to hold that because we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then finally, again, across all these organizations, their ability to report their findings and recommendations is really extremely critical. It's their mission, and for all of these organizations, it's hardwired into their work that they are able to report out their findings in a transparent way. So those are just some common themes. I'm going to turn it over to Leslie, who's going to also touch on some themes.
Okay, thanks. So at the federal level, the OIG and GAO are similarly situated in the government structure, just as their state counterparts are. And all of them, as they mentioned in the video, are part of a system of checks and balances that not many people really know about. It's important to understand that their placement so that you understand who they have the authority to audit, evaluate, and investigate. So at the federal level, the GAO is considered an arm of Congress, and it can evaluate and investigate any agency in the federal government, which really means that they're largely focused on executive branch agencies. And you can jump in, they may have some purview in judicial. I'm not completely aware of that. But basically, they have very broad discretion to audit, investigate, or evaluate all parts of government. And then in addition, within executive branch agencies of the federal government, each one has an inspector general, and their oversight work is focused on their individual agency. Similarly, at the state level, most state audit departments are considered part of the legislative branch, but actually not all of them are, and I'll talk about an exception in a minute. The Georgia Department of Audits and other state equivalents have the same purview as GAO, meaning we are able to audit and conduct reviews of any state agency or commission, as well as some constitutional offices in Georgia. Not all of the agencies are part of the executive branch, but you might have an elected state superintendent of schools or the elected labor commissioner or the ag commissioner, and we have purview to audit all of them, as well as, again, authorities and commissions. I don't know if I can speak to all states, but in Georgia, we do have a few inspectors general located in a few agencies. For us, it's the Department of Community Health, Department of Public Health, and the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. So while not everywhere, we do also have a state level IG presence. So I was mentioning the special situation whereby not all state accountability agencies are actually part of the legislature. There are actually elected state auditors. Probably the most famous one was Senator Claire McCaskill from Missouri. She is a former state auditor, and she was an elected position versus part of the legislative branch. And then I'll describe this later when I talk about history, but some states have multiple accountability agencies. They may have like a state department of audits, and then they may have a legislative audit committee that directs the work of a legislative staff who do evaluations and reviews as well. So sometimes they can coexist in the state together, and the history that I'll get into in a minute will describe how that came to be. So that is kind of the backdrop of how they're organized. And this is kind of going to lead us to what Anne was talking about, is really talking about across these entities, there are important structural factors in place at OIG, GAO, and their state equivalents that allow us to work independently and to limit interference or lack of cooperation among those agencies who are being audited or reviewed. And the way that this independence is achieved is really through four main ways: how the agency head is appointed, the budget process, the requirement to report, and various statutory provisions, such as the ones that establish who's appointed, the budget process, and the requirement to report. Those are all in statute, but there are also additional statutory provisions that help enhance our ability to do our work independently and without interference. So I wanted to just give a couple examples of how that is. So for example, the GAO is headed by the US Comptroller General. That position is appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate for a 15-year term. So the longevity of the term helps it endure multiple presidents and a lot of turnover. The budget of the GAO is not subject to change by the executive branch before being introduced to Congress. Only Congress can change the budget and move it through the budget process. Again, this is to limit the potential for interference because, again, the GAO is looking at a lot of executive branch agencies, right, and trying to critically evaluate them and determine if they're efficient and effective and report on it. And of course, then there are statutory provisions, and GAO enjoys very broad mandate to investigate how federal funds are spent all across the government. In Georgia, I work for the state auditor, and he is the head of our agency. He is elected by the House and Senate for an indefinite term until there is a joint resolution by both chambers of the General Assembly to either not to nominate and elect a new state auditor. So the auditor either has to resign or they decide to nominate someone new. So again, it's an indefinite term. Likewise, the Department of Audit's budget is not subject to change by the governor. We submit it through that budget process, but he must submit it to the General Assembly untouched. And then they can decide to make changes to our budget as necessary. All of those things are included in our statute, our legal authority, but we also have a couple other provisions that also help us to do our work independently. One is that we can access all matter of information from agencies. That includes confidential information that no other entity can obtain. We can get tax data, we can get health information, we can get education information for the purposes of evaluation. So that allows us to do work that a lot of other entities, including academic institutions, sometimes have a hard time getting in order to be able to evaluate. So it's a very powerful tool, and it also helps us ensure that the agency isn't withholding information from us. We also we have subpoena power and we have investigative power. Another key feature in our statute is that the House and Senate Appropriations Committees can request what they are calling a special examination. It's just another word for auditing, evaluation, all the words that would review things that we're talking about, accountability of state agencies. So they can request each year that we do specific work at their direction. And so, Anne, can you talk a little bit about kind of the similar structural components for independence within the OIG? I believe those are a little bit different there.
Yes, some of them are exactly the same, and I do want to hit on this issue about ability to compel records and use of subpoena. We have that in the Inspector General's office as well, so that is the same. The other thing is any information that we develop, reports, are not subject to clearance within the executive branch. So if we write a report about a program, say about a Medicare program, then while there is a collaborative process to share those reports and get agency comment, and we do incorporate those comments into the report, before that report becomes public, it does not have to be signed off by the executive agency. And if you're in an executive agency, I didn't really realize until I became out of the Inspector General office into an executive agency, how powerful that was. So that's extremely important. The other thing for the IG is, and this was very important when the 1978 Inspector General Act was enacted, which established the Inspectors General, is that the IGs have dual reporting authority. So that means they report to both Congress and to the agency head. Now, when I was there, we called it walking the tightrope because you're always kind of not wanting to go either side of the other. One of the books that I actually pulled to prepare for this session, which I'll put the name in the chat, U.S. Inspector General's Truth Tellers in Turbulent Times. They talked about it as the barbed wire, right? So you're walking over the barbed wire. So you're always trying, you're trying to compel change in government, right? You're trying to produce information, factual information, findings, recommendations to compel change, yet you are trying to do it in an independent way. So this dual reporting was extremely important to really require the Inspector Generals to be collaborative and work both with Congress and the executive agencies. So that, and I think, to a large part, it's been successful. I think the other thing is we can pick in the Inspector General, we pick the topics. Agencies can ask us for topics, Congress can ask for topics, but really most of the work that's done, at least at the HHS Inspector General, when I was there, it was like 80% of it was we generated our own topics based on significance and possibility for impact. I think
so
that
Anne,
please.
I was going to ask that how you decide on a topic, like what drives you to choose something.
So it's a great topic, and Leslie predicted this would be one of the first questions we would get. So I'll start and Leslie can add. So, and this is when I was in DC, this was actually, I shifted from doing the evaluations to actually figuring this stuff out. So essentially, I mean, you're doing a very detailed environmental scan and lit review, and this is sort of how I would describe it now. So like, for example, I worked on child support enforcement topics, right? So you are reading all the literature, you're reading the laws that govern those programs, you're going to seminars, you're reading the newsletters at the time. I mean, we didn't have the internet when I was working there initially, but anyway, but now you would be looking on the internet. You're constantly scanning, and we had criteria, like you're not, you have to make this, you want to look at programs where maybe there's a lot of federal expenditures, right? Because or programs that might not have a lot of federal expenditures, but they have a huge impact on the public, right? So there was some recent work that was done out of HHS-IG on the zero tolerance policy under the Trump administration, unaccompanied children, and they went in to say, because HHS there's a program, the Refugee Resettlement Program has authority over those kids, and basically went in and wrote a report and talked about how they weren't able to track those parents and children who had been separated. So again, not a lot of high dollar program, but huge impact in terms of the human impact on people. So it's a variety of factors. It is a little bit of an art, but these are all published. So the Inspector General, I'm not sure if GAO publishes their work plans or not, but they're all out there so that you can kind of see there's a lot of work being done on COVID right now. So, and it depends what group you're in. There's sort of some routine audits that have to get done. In the evaluation office that I was in, it was really more about you're trying to do timely, relevant information for decision makers, right? So you're trying to predict where are the topics, where are things going, and then what is Congress interested in, right? Because sometimes, or what is the agency interested in, right? So I don't know, Leslie, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I would say our work is 50-50 in terms of its selection, meaning we choose about 50% of the topics ourselves, and then about 50% come through those legislative committees that I mentioned to you who make a request of us each year. In terms of our choices to select, it's similar to what Anne's talking about. It's an environmental scan, which means we're aware of all the current events of the day. We know what the legislature is interested in by virtue of the news, as well as watching committee hearings. And then some of it is risk assessment. And the factors include the size of the budget, the number of people impacted, whether there's a vulnerable population impacted that may not be able to speak for itself, such as an adult protective services program we looked at, which is to protect elderly and adults with disabilities from abuse, neglect, and fraud. So that's just an example. So the other thing is coverage. Because we're so small, unlike the resources of GAO or even an inspector general at the federal level, we are trying to get what we call coverage over many policy areas across state government so that we don't leave any one place unexamined at a point in time. So those are a number of factors. And again, it's more of an art than a science. There's not an exact formula or weighting scale that we use, though we've tried to do that. But in the end, it really is a judgment call based on kind of some collective experience that you gain over time. And we've kind of hit the nail on the head a couple times with topics ended up being right on time magically as being a current event. So opioid abuse was one that our timing was great on that. A number of them, that's just because we read a lot. We read a lot of studies. We look at other states' reports. We're reading the news so that we have a sense of kind of what are the emerging topips.
Yeah, that was my question, was how far in advance that you have to pick, or that you know, and also how long does it take to produce the report so you can time that right? I guess Georgia would be different than federal, of course.
So, yeah, I mean, and let me just say one other thing. In GAO, at least it used to be the opposite. It's more like 80% of their topics are requested from Congress versus, so IG has a little bit more independence for picking topics. But so, you know, it depends. The evaluation group, and again, I'll give you an analogy. I'm going to quote Dick Kusero again. The auditors are kind of the infantry, right? They're plodding along doing compliance work, and they do some performance audits as well, but it's they have a certain schedule sometimes that they cover things, although they can do other studies. The criminal investigators are kind of the artillery. They're finding wrongdoers, you know, bad people who are doing bad things, ripping off the government. And then he always called the evaluators the cavalry, because we run in as needed and we get the information and get it done quickly and move it, come back out and produce the report. So it took us, I would say it's about, once you really start, it's about 6 months from start to finish to actually do the work. And then it's another 6 months at least of clearance within the IG because of all the quality control. You know, we had to cite every single sentence in a report, had to have a citation. And then you also have to get comment from the agency. So that's another 3 months if they answer you in a timely manner, which they don't usually. So it can be an 18-month process to actually produce a report, at least when I was doing it. My guess is it hasn't changed. Now, the HHS IG did a report with respect to COVID and went into hospitals to look at capacity for them to handle patients. And I would venture to guess they probably did it in a couple of months. So you can speed up if you need to, but on average, I think, you know, it is about 18 months. So I don't know if it's similar for you, Leslie.
It makes me feel better about how long ours take.
And sometimes they're even longer than that.
Ours are like,
one that went 24 months one time.
It's just something we're constantly battling. Ours are 6 months to 10 to 12 months. When we can control the scope, like which objectives, which research questions we're going to answer. My professional goal is, I tell my staff, I don't want it to have a birthday. Like, I hate it when it has a birthday, because then the data gets old, things change, your work isn't, maybe they've changed their procedures and policies, so it gets dated. So I really hate when it takes longer than a year. We usually are about 6 months to 9 months. I think GAO, from what I understand, I think who asked the question about how far in advance, my understanding is they get those come in year more in advance before they even get started. They have a very rigorous process to screen the congressional requests that go through there to try to evaluate which one should rise to the top. Ours, we have a very unbureaucratic process. We can decide to do something if we have the resources at a moment's notice, but we're constantly planning at 6-month intervals for the next 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, in the IG, yeah, you have a work plan, which is basically your plan, but some things can be done anytime and some things have to be more timely. So in the IG's office, you could pick something up like that if you needed to, if it was important to do that. And that was done, and that I think was extremely important. And once again, providing that timely, relevant information to decision makers, right? So that they could take action on those reports. Because as an IG, as a GAO, as a performance audit group, the last thing you want is for your report to sit on somebody's shelf, literally their shelf or in their file folder nowadays. So you really want to try to do work that's timely. Let me move on. I think we've covered, I mean, there's other things we could cover with inspector generals and their structures, but I think those are we've covered the main topics. So I think we want to shift now to history a little bit. So I'm going to kick it off and talk a little bit about the history of the IGs. And, this idea of oversight and, protecting the public purse is, I don't know, probably been around since, I don't know, the Romans probably, but, in this country, George Washington actually did end up appointing an inspector general when he, in 1775, when he couldn't appear to get an accurate count of soldiers for a battle. And he said, we really need somebody somebody to sort of come in there and give me the information that I need to do my work. So this concept goes way back, and really the military pioneered the inspectors general in the government. What happened, and I'm going to talk about the history in kind of 3 buckets. I'm going to talk about kind of the creation of the inspectors general, a little bit on the early years, and then just a little bit of recent history. So there were, and this was an important thing for the IGs, there were a couple of IGs prior to 1978. They were not statutory. So these were IGs that had been created by those executive branches, but they were agents of that executive branch. They didn't have the kind of independence. The first one really was, there was some in a foreign assistance program and in agriculture, and then what was used to be, I don't know how many people remember this, so HHS, which is now Health and Human Services, used to be Health, Education, and Welfare. So it had the education department and we had Social Security. There was an IG created there in 1976, but with the 1978 Inspector General's Act, almost all agencies across government got, essentially, they established inspectors general. This history, okay, this was I mean, there was a lot of support for this. Remember, this was post Watergate years, right? This was sort of good government, and in many respects, it was bipartisan support for this. But I don't think you would be surprised that Congress is the one who really wanted these inspector general, and one of the reasons they wanted them is that they wanted to have more say and power and knowledge and insight into that workings of the executive branch, right? So the inspector generals actually sort of ushered in a period of increased congressional oversight, because the inspectors general could collect information and report to Congress on things which Congress didn't really easily have a way to get without the inspectors general. Now, you might not be surprised that the executive agencies were not that excited about the creation of an inspector general's office, and they were not that excited that they were not going to report directly to the agency head. So there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of controversy, but in the end, Congress obviously prevailed, and it was really in their interest, and it was really from both sides of the aisles. Although there is a history, and I don't know a lot about it, but there is a history of, there were different visions for how these offices should be formed. So that's for another day. But again, and at that point, that was established, the mission is really, again, reducing fraud, waste, and abuse, and then improving efficiency and effectiveness of programs. And then a little aside, the criminal investigators and the auditors were in the law. There was language that signaled doing evaluations, but the evaluations component was not part of the statute. So, but those offices got added, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the 80s. So that's kind of the establishment of the Inspector General's office. The early years of the IG were really one, and that would be sort of, again, post 1978, you know, like for the next decade, were a time of growth, both in terms of staff and both in terms of resources for the work. And interestingly enough, the Office of Management and Budget kind of decided to be the advocate for the inspectors general, and in fact formed what was called the PCIE, basically a presidential commission of inspector generals to sort of all work together across the federal sector. And you know, I suppose it's not so surprising, right? Because OMB also wants information about what's going on with the executive branches as well. So one of the books that I was looking at sort of, and I didn't realize this at the time, sort of attributed some of the growth to the strong support of OMB for many, many years, which I actually did observe when I was there. So again, I think the early years were a time of growth, building these offices, adding the evaluation function. And if you look at that time period, once again, you would see there's all kinds of tables showing increasingly IGs not only publishing reports, but testifying before Congress. And again, an upswing in terms of congressional oversight, which we've kind of talked a little bit about. So those are kind of what I would call the early years of the IGs. And then, and I will say, one of the things that happened early on, but it was an anomaly. In 1981, which would have been the first presidential transition with the IGs in place, Ronald Reagan came in and fired all of the IGs. Now, the law does allow for the president to fire the IGs, but has to report to Congress upon so doing. However, many of them got reappointed, and it was really an anomaly. Okay, so except for there's a few examples under the Trump administration, but up until that time, for the most part, really the presidential transitions have not resulted in the inspector generals leaving. The inspector generals don't have term limits, so they're not protected in that way. But and they can be fired. But there was this sort of anomaly, and again, until the Trump administration, that's sort of been respected. They have been viewed as, you know, nonpartisan, not aligned with the administration. So those are the early years. And then most recently, and I'm just going to run through this kind of quickly. You know, I think just what I have observed is just the proliferation and the growth of these functions, the growth of their budgets, the institutionalization. I mean, you can't like almost get through a week without hearing about the IG, right? So, you know, there's just a lot of really good, and not just, I mean, it used to be when I was at HHS, we were the biggest and the most well-developed. And, you know, you look across the agencies now and it's just phenomenal to see the growth that's occurred. So I'm going to end my part of the history section with just a little bit on what did happen in the Trump administration. And essentially, you know, Trump actually fired 4 inspector generals. The State Department Inspector General, presumably for investigating Pompeo, the Health and Human Services Inspector General, although she was acting because of the work that was done going into hospitals, looking at the capacity of hospitals to respond to COVID. The Department of Defense Inspector General, and I'm not sure why he was fired, but Glenn Fine was the IG there, who basically used to be the IG at Justice. He's a very well-respected official. And then the Intelligence Community Inspector General was fired after the whistleblower complaint about the Ukraine which launched the impeachment investigation of the president. So, and there were other things going on with Trump, the administration sort of interference around trying to stall reports, you know, in addition to things like sort of ignoring the data in the reports. But, you know, that's not necessarily just a phenomenon of the Trump administration. So anyway, so it's been a little bit of an anomaly. But when Biden came in, and the other thing that Trump did, when Biden came in, I think there were something like 38 vacancies. So that was the other thing that Trump did is he didn't actually appoint inspector generals to vacancies. So that was another impact of the IG. So that's a broad sketch history. Any questions on that? Or
I was more so because coming in, I had a couple of thoughts like, what's the difference between GAO, OMB? What's the difference between state auditors and having a GAO in the states? So those are starting to be answered. The part about inspectors general slightly threw me because so if you are an inspector general of the department, like we talked about those positions that were just fired, right? Or that were fired in the Trump administration. So let's say like Health and Human Services. Are you an employee of the GAO, or the GAO exists separately and then each federal department also has their IG?
okay, so GAO and IGs are completely different.
Right.
They are not the same organizations. They don't work for the same people. GAO works for Congress. They are part of the legislative branch of government. Inspectors general work for the executive branch. They work, and they also report to Congress, but they work for the executive branch. They are executive branch employees, and you have one for every major cabinet agency, and you also have a bunch for little small agencies as well. So you have an HHS inspector general, and you have a Social Security Administration inspector general, and you have a Housing and Urban Development inspector general.
So their interest is obviously aligned with the interests of that particular department, but their job within that department is to function in that way as far as oversight, accountability. So essentially each department has kind of two levels: congressional oversight from the GAO and oversight accountability through the IG's work.
Yeah, and it's not just interest, they only have authority within their department. So if I'm Health and Human Services, I have authority to compel records and to do work only within Health and Human Services.
It's like an internal audit function.
Right.
And not to insert myself, but to make things even more confusing, sometimes there are acts of Congress that actually require internal inspector generals to audit something. So
we would get those requests sometimes too. Yeah, those are sometimes written into
like they audit themselves or audit their own department.
Right. And so that's why this terminology has started to become really fluid across all of them. You know, Anne's referring to auditors within the IG, and then sometimes we're called auditors, or different states calls them evaluators. And so there's a whole spectrum of work you can do under any of those titles, and it does make it a little bit more confusing, but you did summarize it very well, Michelle. That is generally correct. And that's why when I was talking about this, the independence, if you think about independent, like and OIG within an agency is independent, but they probably have to withstand a little more political pressure, for example, than the GAO does, meaning because within that executive branch, the president has made their cabinet designee, and that OIG reports to them as well as to the Congress, whereas the GAO probably is a little more removed from the potential for interference, or the concern again about the barbed wire, walking that line between your boss, who is ultimately, you know, the president, and then the Congress.
Right. The pressure GAO would get would be from the requester in Congress, but no, but you're right. They don't have, when GAO comes in and does an audit or an evaluation, they're just less, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but they're less worried about what the agency thinks about them. I don't want to say less collaborative, because it's not that they're not collaborative, but they don't, like, IGs bend over backwards to make sure the agencies review the reports, that there aren't any factual errors, that we accurately summarize the agency's concerned that there's a disagreement. And GAO is less so. They act more independently.
The GAO and audit shops, we follow auditing standards, and you do have to allow the agency to respond and correct factual inaccuracies, and their responses get put in the report. So we do have a process that we have to do that as well.
Right, but it is true, but GAO doesn't share draft reports with agencies. at the federal level, but IG, they share statements of fact, which is different than sharing the report. And the inspectors general share the full report. So there are some distinctions. It's interesting, but there's a lot of commonality. I guess that's what Leslie and I were trying to say. I mean, don't get so, I mean, it's good to understand the distinctions, but I think the way that they have a lot more in common than they have apart in terms of just what they're trying to accomplish, you know, and there are some nuances in how they can do it, but there's just a lot of commonality.
So Anne, you mentioned the Reagan and then Trump firing a handful of IGs. Did they rehire? Did they just think they wanted smaller government and so didn't hire them? Or like, what was the end result of that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to that. I mean, what happens is when they fire an IG, then somebody who's in that office, like a deputy inspector general, will be the acting until these are presidentially appointed, congressionally approved positions. So someone will sort of carry the helm until someone else is appointed. But they're supposed to be appointed. Those are not supposed to be vacant positions, but they'll just get filled when they get filled. So I'm not sure I have more insight on it other than that.
Just continuing the partisan character of what's going on there, George W. Bush also got rid of 4 IGs right after 9/11 in 2002.
I didn't know.
Can you speak more to that? Like, what was the... Okay, so maybe we'll speak one to what do you think the motivation was versus what did they say their motivation was for doing that?
Go ahead, Ann.
Well, I don't know those particulars. I mean, the president doesn't have to say why they're firing the IG. It's not required. They simply have to notify. One can draw one's own conclusions about, you know, why they do that. But there's
the speculation would be that there's something in a report that they may look like their cabinet or their branch or that agency look bad.
These were largely preemptive strikes, though. They weren't based on any kind of performance. They were based on a presumption that that the folks holding those offices would write critical reports. And before they had a chance to do any of that, they got fired. And in W's, I didn't go through all of them, but in W's case, you know, you tried to replace them with, you know, folks who were more sympathetic to what W wanted to do.
Right. I mean, there was, and I don't know the backstory. I'm not going to comment on it because I wasn't there. But after the 2000 election, that was decided by the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Rehnquist, Janet Rehnquist, his daughter, was appointed as the HHS Inspector General without any qualifications that typically one would have to be appointed as an Inspector General. She wasn't an auditor, she was an investigator, you know, and she, and I don't know, it was after a couple of years, there was a GAO inquiry, and you can look it up. There were all kinds of problems, and she ended up essentially getting pushed out. So, you know, I mean, you can imagine, again, we've been talking about the ideal. These are nonpartisan, these are independent, but there's push and pull, right? And I think, and that's why I think some of the most successful IGs are able to walk that tightrope and, you know, assert their independence but yet IG has no authority to make agencies do anything. So, and if you think about that, so what you want to do is make a really strong case in your report as to why you're right or what the issues are. And then also, hopefully you have credible recommendations. But you want to build those. And I saw this when I was there. If you sort of build relationships with some of the agencies, they actually see you as a way to help them accomplish their goals. And that's when you're most, that's when you can be most effective. And sometimes that's on big things, and sometimes that's on, you know, smaller things, but that is one of the challenges.
There's the agency, and then there's the agency, right? They're the political appointees, and then the career folks in the agency. How much of that consultation and interaction that you have at the state and the national level is with the political folks at the agencies?
For us, they show up at what we call our entrance conference, where we introduce ourselves and talk about what our research objectives are going to be and how we're going to do our work. And then they usually show up at an exit conference, which is where we verbally go over what is going to be in the report before they actually get a hard copy draft to review. It's our opportunity to kind of float the trial balloon, see what they're going to say, find out if there's any key information that we possibly missed or did not consider. But during the performance audit, we're often dealing with the experts in the program, the management, the staff, and the people that kind of know how it's operating. So that's generally how that happens. Again, part of the communication and collaboration strategy is your goal is never to have a surprise at the end. You don't want the agency to be surprised about what you're finding, so you should be communicating all along. Occasionally it does happen because you cannot get the attention of the kind of senior ranking partisan appointment person until the end. And that can, back to adding time, that can really set things back if their staff have not done a good job informing them of all of our meetings, all of our communications, and the work we're doing all along. So it's mainly the bureaucrats who are the experts in the area.
It's similar, except for, you know, HHS, it's a much bigger agency. I mean, it's a huge bureaucracy. And so depending on which part of HHS, there aren't as many political appointees. Typically, you wouldn't have a political appointee at an entrance or exit conference, but the heads of the agencies would sign off on the final comments from the that were prepared by the agency on the report. So they would essentially have kind of accountability for responding to those comments that were made on the report. But yeah, we worked primarily with you know, kind of experts. So
thanks.
I have a question. I'm curious, you know, I think it's very rare, at least in the federal space. I have to admit, I don't know much, Leslie, about, you know, like, I don't know if I've ever actually looked at a state audit report, but I will now after this session. But you know, I think it's very rare for agencies not to concur with IG recommendations, but it does happen. And I was just wondering, Anne, if you could kind of like explain, like, is there usually work back and forth, like with the agency to get to so that doesn't happen, or that it's like a more useful recommendation maybe?
Yeah, and I worked on this a lot when I was in DC. So, you know, you're right, but what I found frequently is the agency would, their first sentence would say, "We concur," and then, you know, when you actually read much of what they were going to do, it didn't necessarily commit to
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that.
So it's like the concur, but, and it was very challenging because there is a process to track those recommendations. And by the way, that information is reported to Congress, the status of the implementation of whether they're implemented or not. And we used to carry around these, it's called the Orange Book and the Red Book, these big thick books, unimplemented recommendations, right? The Orange Book were programmatic recommendations, and then the Red Book were cost savings. So the problem is IG doesn't really have authority to make people do anything. Again, if Congress wants to hold people to the fire, or if somebody in the executive agency wants to, but I wouldn't say there's a ton of, and we would actually reach out to the agency and have some conversations and try to work through, you know, to get more information about what they're doing. But I would say that's a small percentage of what they did, at least in the Inspector General's office. You know, you're spending most of your resources actually writing the reports, you know, and, you know, planning what you're going to do. So it's a small part of the time. I think it's a little bit of a weakness. And I'll say that, and it's interesting because what I found, I don't know about you, Leslie, and maybe it's different at the state level because it's, because, you know, we would do these are national studies, right? So, you know, you'd spend a lot of time on the findings and you'd certainly spend time thinking about the recommendations, but you didn't want to write them too specific because you might not actually understand how best the problem should be fixed. What you really want is the problem fixed, and you want to indicate enough about here's the key recommendations and let the agencies decide. But sometimes it's very broad, like a lot of programs, like there's stock recommendations, like the program doesn't have adequate performance measures, you know, to measure their performance, right? I mean, that's like you can almost write that for, you know, almost all the programs. So it is interesting how it works with recommendations. It's really up to others to pick up those recommendations, whether it's the public, the media, Congress, or again, somebody in the executive branch to sort of take that and run. But IG doesn't have much authority to actually, it's sort of more the power of the sort of the bully pulpit function, you know, and the publicizing is sometimes what results in action, not necessarily what the recommendations say exactly.
So I could add to that, Amanda. We work really hard at unraveling the cause of the problem so that we can get a good recommendation. We go to a lot of there's evidence-based practices and in clearinghouses like the What Works clearinghouse and other things where various programs have been evaluated. There are meta-analyses of studies. And so we will go there for ideas about what works to solve a problem. We'll look at other states. We talk a lot with the agency. We go to their professional organizations oftentimes. So we do a lot of work to try to get a really actionable recommendation. Sometimes they're not super specific to the point Anne was making, but when we can make a good recommendation like that, we do. And we too cannot force anybody to implement our recommendations, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself on impact, but we enjoy an 85% implementation rate of our findings and recommendations. So I feel like we do produce some things that they can use to improve either operations or make changes to laws, rules, regulations to allow the program to operate more efficiently, effectively. But, you know, it kind of depends, kind of like what Anne's talking about. So you don't want to be overly prescriptive because you do want to give them some latitude, but sometimes, you know, you've done enough research to know what some good best practices are. So.
And just another example, and this is actually an example of probably lack of impact, but this happens too. So the IG for many, many years, and even I think to this day, has been writing various reports about drug prices in the Medicare program and how much cost savings we could put in place if we did basically the way the VA does it, right, with sort of price limits. But the IG wrote reports for years on that. It's a huge cost savings issue, but Congress has never been willing to work on it because of the strong pharmaceutical lobby. So that's an example of where they've, and the IGs will do that. They'll they build, what happens over time is they build a lot of expertise. And so they'll do not just one report, right? It's a series of reports that they'll do to try to make improvements, in an area or highlight, like the unaccompanied children program that I talked about. I think they issued 3 or 4 reports. They do a lot of work, and we haven't really gotten into a lot of the topics, but a lot of work on nursing homes and other places. But the IGs do, and some of the videos I was talking about, they do document fairly well this return on investment, issue, which I think got mentioned earlier, and also, certain number of criminal convictions, number of compliance findings, et cetera. They're pretty good at quantifying their impact. So we're at 9:20, and I don't know, Leslie, maybe we just kind of on the fly, maybe we should skip to, this is great. And actually, I think we covered a lot of the topics.
We also started late.
Oh, that's true. We did start late. But I mean, do we want to maybe skip to some of the policy implications? Because I think that's kind of would be interesting for this group because it ties it back to some of the other work. So I think you were going to start on that one. Is that?
Okay, let me get my, yes. So I think we've already mentioned some of the types of implications that the work across the OIG, audit offices, GAO can have. They really can, as I mentioned, inform legislation, policy, and regulations. Oftentimes, I think we find that the problems we see in implementation are not just caused by lack of resources or poor management or poor procedures, as sometimes it goes back to the actual design or the way the law was written. Another impact is, of course, improving program implementation. I think that's where our bread and butter is that's a lot easier to affect than a change in law. But again, we try to have those actionable recommendations so that programs can use their resources more efficiently and achieve the goals that they are intended to do with better success. Of course, I didn't go into the history of this, but I mean, and the audit and GAO started as accounting functions. So there's this kind of fiscal responsibility thing that it started with, and it has evolved beyond accounting into this evaluation and understanding what impacts programs have and whether they're working. So there is still this component of we are supposed to help be stewards of the taxpayer dollars. And so we want outcomes to be measured. We want them to be achieved. And if they're not working, what do we do differently? Of course, with the fiscal accountability thing, there's an expectation that we find fraud, waste, and abuse through our work. Of course, our work strengthens congressional oversight. But another kind of role that a lot of people don't think about is we sometimes become agenda setters. So the best way to, and I can get into an example of this, is let's say we pick a topic. They haven't requested a particular topic, so it wasn't something that they were planning to take up during the session, but we may issue a report that highlights some problems, and suddenly it can become a top agenda item. So those are kind of the policy implications in general that can be felt across all of these groups. Anne, is there anything to add on that before we just give a couple examples of impacts?
I think the only thing I'll add, because I don't think it got mentioned, but I know for the Inspector Generals, it is written in their statute that they actually do provide comments on policies and regulations that come out of the department where they sit. So they do have a strong role in, and a lot of times what happens is the IGs can bring forward in the regulatory process the body of knowledge around a particular topic to help inform how regulation is developed. And the other thing is, and I presume this still happens, this is when I was there, it wasn't unusual for Congress to send us legislative language and have us comment on that legislative language based on our body of an experience, a body of work. And the other thing I'll say, just because we're on this topic, I mean, this is an example of an impact, but and this was sort of my probably the impact I'm most proud of when I was in the Inspector General's office is we did a study on looking at the federal foster care system, and we asked a very simple question, which was, you know, how often are kids in care visited by their caseworker? And the standard for that there wasn't a federal standard, but the Child Welfare League of America had a standard of how frequent that was supposed to occur. And we went to the states, and about half of them couldn't even tell us how frequently they visited the kids in care. And then for those who could tell us, they weren't meeting the standards. And Congress essentially picked up the verbiage from our report and plopped it into a piece of legislation and actually passed a law to improve to require states to report how often they're visiting kids in care, and also to follow, you know, the professional standards about how often kids in care are supposed to be reported. So, you know, and by the way, that's one example, but there's probably hundreds of examples where IG reports have been used to craft legislation. So just wanted to make sure that I made that point. But, sorry, Liz, I kind of skipped ahead a little.
No, that's okay.
But no, I think that's in terms of policy implications. I mean, we hit on the congressional oversight and the, you know, kind of how these things work together. So I think that was pretty important. So I think maybe we want to talk maybe a little bit about, I know you were going to talk a little bit about impact. I have put out a couple of examples, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about challenges.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to quickly share screen here.
And I had another video, but that's, I mean, it's kind of about impact. Maybe we could show that. Kind of wake people up a little bit. Oh, good, Leslie's. Oh, good, you're going to show that. Yeah.
Okay, tell me if my screen is correct here now. Let's see.
Yeah.
So am I seeing, are you seeing the right?
It's
Flipped?
No, but it's okay. I mean, we can see it.
Okay, let me
It's
see.
showing all the.
We see the presenter view.
I know, and I'm trying to, how did I switch?
Thank you,
that
Michelle.
before?
I couldn't think of the word.
We can still see it though, so you can go ahead.
Okay, let's just go with this. So just as a quick, you know, high level impacts for the Performance Audit Division at the Georgia Department of Audits. Not all our reports are about cost savings because there are other impacts that are also important, but we have saved about $100 million in either cost savings or revenue enhancements annually since 2010, something we're really proud of. For every dollar spent on performance auditing in the state of Georgia, we return $22. As I mentioned earlier, our other impact, and one that, while the other ones are kind of sexy, I'm really more proud of this, is the implementation rate of recommendations. That's really like where services to people and outcomes of programs improve, and it isn't always about dollars. So we're very proud of that. And then another phenomena that has really been on the rise is we keep getting written into bills to do work on X and work on Y, and, you know, wanting an annual performance audit of these various things. And I try to take that as a compliment because they trust us to do thorough, independent, and unbiased work. The problem though with me, and I'm getting a little bit ahead into challenges, is I only have 30 people. So if I start committing people to an annual review of the same program, let's say it's even not a very high dollar amount, but it may be like something that you know is very near and dear to someone's agenda, and they get it passed, then we're dedicating very limited resources to the same policy areas over again. So, but it is a measure, it is a way we measure how well we're doing with regard to our credibility. And so that's something that we're proud of. So wanted to highlight just a couple things here. Let's see, I really wish I could switch the slide for you so you didn't see my notes. Let's see. Example impacts. So agenda setting, we've done 2 reports on film tax credit, which is a very popular film tax credit by Democrats and Republicans in this state, and it is also our largest tax credit. This was not a requested topic, and we chose it because of its size. It's the largest tax credit we have, and it had never been independently evaluated. And I'll get to what happened with that shortly because it actually ticks all of these boxes. But that was one where suddenly it became a focus and bills were introduced to address some of the issues that we found in these 2 audits of the film tax credit. Another example is Composite Medical Board. It's the entity that licenses and regulates physicians. There wasn't a whole lot of enforcement of problems or complaints there. And the AJC, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, ran a big story on that, which became something that really appealed to people. I got calls from individual people who had had issues with physicians. I got calls from physicians who were wrongly treated by the board. So it really struck a chord with people. With regard to the film tax credit, again, example of policy change, House Bill 1037 mandated audits of all film and TV projects. It also helped clarify language that we pointed out was vague in the law that allowed a lot of unintended credits to be claimed at millions and millions of dollars because of very vague language in the law. On the implementation route, this is an older report, but one we're really proud of is way back when they were starting criminal justice reform, we looked at a couple districts were experimenting with adult felony drug courts as a way to keep people from being imprisoned. This would allow them to go into, therapy and drug assistance programs instead of going to jail. And we identified nearly $10,000 at that time per drug court participant in savings from reduced recidivism, and it led to the expansion of the drug courts and participation, which we estimate saved about 100 million since the report's release. And then an example of some of the dollar savings impacts that we have is we did an audit of the Wildlife Resources Division, which they're supposed to be protecting wildlife and the state properties, but they had very little money in their budget. And we discovered that their fee rates were set so low that they weren't even leveraging federal matching dollars for some of their, because the matching dollars was based on the number of hunting and licensing, hunting licenses that they issued. And some they were offering free, but if you offered like a nominal amount, like $1, you could leverage federal funds, and that generated $7 million in annual revenue for them. And so then they were able to actually execute some of the things they need to fulfill their mission. So those are just a couple impacts. I really need to switch my screen so you'll be able to see this better, but
I think that button you just clicked over, the half screen one below, I think that one might work. Nope, never mind.
I did it just before we got on the call.
Yeah, you did. Maybe that.
All right, well, I'm going to do my best here. So this is, we issued 2 reports on the film tax credit. As you can see, we are front page. It's a very popular tax credit. It's the largest tax credit in the US. It's more generous than New York, if you can believe that. The cost of the credit had grown to about $915 million per year. The thing about this incentive was that if they got a credit on 30% of their expenditures. So if they spent $9 million in expenditures, they got $3 million. This would be a film company, $3 million in credit to use against their taxes. Well, oftentimes they had no tax liability. And a key feature of this tax credit was they could sell it on the market for 80 cents on the dollar. That was the going rate. So they made money off the credit, and then the individual who bought the credit could claim it against their tax liability. So it's a fiscal red flag that we are trying to wave with this. But we found that while the state has granted billions in credits, it does not have an adequate system of controls to prevent the improper granting of credits. We found issues with the credits administration by the Department of Revenue and Economic Development. These were attributed to limited requirements and clarity in the law, inadequately designed procedures, insufficient resources, and agency interpretations of the law that differ from our own. The statute did not require audits of the film companies who are claiming this. And as you could tell, there was a huge incentive to pump up the expenditures that they're claiming in order to increase their credit because they can make money on selling the credit. They had Department of Revenue had limited documentation from these production companies in order to receive the credit. They conducted little verification of eligibility, and we found about 130 million questionable eligibility projects. So we recommended that we had 35 recommendations in the first report, that they require audits of every project paid for by the film companies themselves, and then dozens of recommendations about how Department of Revenue and Economic Development needed to improve their administration. The second report looked at the economic impact and the fiscal impact. And let's see here. We found that the agency had been overstating by double the economic impact to the state. They were using a multiplier of 3.57. So they were saying that the ripple effect in the economy was 3.57, when in actuality it was closer to 1.84. We couldn't find, they didn't know the origin of the 3.57 multiplier that they used to predict its economic impact. We couldn't find anything similar in economic literature in any industry. So they've been overstating the impact on jobs, as well as the economy. So, you know, the induced spending and additional taxes that would be generated through the tax incentive. So anyway, I'm going to stop there about impacts, but those particular reports are kind of examples across all the ways that we can impact government. So we're real proud of that. And as luck would have it today, my staff doesn't even know this today, we were just announced to be the winners of the Excellence and Accountability Award by the National State Auditors Association for our work in this area. So it's big news. In Nerdville, it is like the Oscars.
That's fabulous.
Yeah. So let me stop sharing. So those are just some of the impacts we've had. And you want to take it over?
Yeah. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, I guess, you know, I've shared a couple of examples around, I shared my foster care example. I talked a little bit about some of the more current work around the zero tolerance policy under the Trump administration, unaccompanied children, reports on that, looking at what was happening with those kids in care, reporting on that, trying to, you know, provide recommendations, you know, on there. There's so many topics that the inspector general will look at. I can't even, you know, cover them all. The U.S. Capitol Police Inspector General came out with a report today, you know, about how unprepared the Capitol Police were. And, you know, that's a great example of where, you know, that report probably will be used to make significant improvements. And, you know, there were a lot of problems. So, you know, I think maybe now that we've highlighted, it might be one of those things where you start to notice it a little bit more, you know, as you sort of are perusing the paper and things. But again, there's a lot of resources out there around impacts. But I do think, you know, despite what some of the challenges are, and, you know, we started talking about some of those working in these agencies, they, for whatever reasons, and I think a lot of it has to do with probably, you know, they're fairly well established in the bureaucracies where they sit. They have a lot of expertise. They're very professional, and really at a certain level, who isn't against waste, fraud, abuse, and saving money for the federal government? So, you know, despite some of the challenges that they may have, I think that, you know, it's a good model. It seems to prevail. And, you know, the impacts range for everything from administrative to, you know, sometimes major policy changes. There's a huge range, and there's certainly a huge need for, you know, for better government at all those levels. So, you know, the only thing I did recall something I'll share with you guys, because you were asking about, you know, how the Inspector General, how they work within their agencies. You know, when I was there years ago, we were part of something called Operation Restore Trust, and it was a sort of a triad of agencies. It was the Inspector General, it was the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and it was the Administration on Aging. And literally it was an initiative where the three groups worked together to try to reduce fraud and improve administration over. At that time, there was a lot of fraud with durable medical equipment, for senior citizens in home health agencies and nursing homes. And the three agencies actually tried to work together, not only to identify the fraud, but to try to figure out ways to prevent the fraud to begin with. So there are those initiatives, again, where the agencies sort of will all work together and have a common goal. And the agencies really, in some ways, have the same goal as the IG. So again, sometimes they appreciate when you come in, sometimes, sometimes not. HHS is a fairly, has a reputation of being a fairly sort of collaborative, and people don't like slam doors on you or anything when you're in the IG. Now, when I went to Justice in the context of working, and this was in '96, working with law enforcement, and working with lawyers, they were much more combative. When we had, when we did our reports, it was a fascinating dynamic. So, there's probably a little bit different flavor, in different agencies. We actually did a report that was critical of one of Al Gore's Hammer Award projects during reinventing government in the 90s. And they had this great pilot program, but we kind of said, well, yeah, you have this, it was at the border, basically expedited traffic between at the southern border, for people crossing into Mexico and crossing back. So, you had you were pre-registered. This was new at the time in the 90s, right? So you could go back and forth. And, it was an okay program, but it was fairly costly. And we're like, well, but how are you going to expand it to actually reduce traffic at the border? It's really great for these few people, but it's not really addressing the problems that you have around, that you've identified yourself. And, they were very upset. It was very interesting. So anyway, a lot of good war stories. So I don't know. I mean, I think we've hit on some of the challenges, and I don't know if we want to kind of end here, go off camera a little bit. I mean, I don't know, Leslie, did you have any? We didn't.
No,
I don't including remarks, but we.
Yeah, this was really wonderful. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I learned a ton more than I expected, to be honest. So, and there are a lot of obviously new terms, but also new perspectives, both on the work and the amount of people that it takes, the work that's actually done. It's not just always, I thought, primarily evaluation, whether it does the work. And it's obviously a lot more than that. So let's jump off on the recording, and I know we have some questions.
Yeah, and I'll put, Michelle, I'll send you the titles of these books, not that, in your leisure, if you ever have the opportunity or need the opportunity.
Love it.
You can put it by your